So it is said that the legacy of JFK is more in his figure and his words than his actual politics. What do you think of this?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the Kennedy presidency was cut very short. We don't know what would have happened in the remaining year or even years had he won a second term of the Kennedy presidency. And so we're left with sort of the unfinished agenda of Kennedy when we look at his presidency as a separate unit. This was a president who clearly learned a lot on the job. He was very, very effective in the key crisis, of course, of his presidency was the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had to figure out a way to deal with the Soviet Union in the nuclear age that no previous president had to deal with. During the Eisenhower years, the Soviet Union was so far behind the U.S. in terms of military hardware, particularly with respect to nuclear weapons, that Kennedy had to face a very different situation. And the wisdom and the judgment that the Kennedy presidency developed really set the stage for the way that the United States and the Soviet Union dealt with each other throughout the Cold War and avoided that nuclear catastrophe. It's also clear when we think about the Kennedy legacy that there was a real commitment to civil rights and to voting rights in the American South. This was a period of time when Kennedy took office where African Americans generally couldn't vote, and they were often subject to a lot of violence if they tried to argue for any kind of equality in the United States. Now, this is something that develops more extensively after Kennedy's death.
Do you think that Robert and Ted try to follow the legacy of JFK or they try to do their own thing?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that for Robert Kennedy in particular, who had been John F. Kennedy's Attorney General, he had really been very much at the core of some of these civil rights and voting rights issues that were sort of bedeviling the Kennedy administration. You had a bunch of Southern governors who were very conservative who didn't necessarily work with the Kennedy. But I think that Bobby Kennedy basically has his own journey and goes in a somewhat different direction than John F. Kennedy after the president's death. Bobby Kennedy, who might very well have been elected president in 1968 had he not been assassinated, was a very much committed to the development of economic opportunity in marginalized communities. If you think about the Latino farm workers of the Southwest, you think about the African Americans struggling to gain more civil rights, you think about even poor whites in farming communities and mining communities where economic prosperity had really passed them by. Kennedy really had a connection to this dynamic of poverty in America, and it was much more an emphasis of his time as a U.S. senator and as a presidential candidate than it was for John F. Kennedy's presidency. But of course, Bobby Kennedy's opportunity was also cut short by an assassin, and that is one of those big sort of might have beens of American politics. If you think about the 1960s and the tumult and the rise of Richard Nixon and conservative politics that followed, we can imagine a very different America if John F. Kennedy had lived or if Bobby Kennedy had lived. Either of them, had they had more time in public life, might have made a much more gentle society, a much kinder society, and a society, at least in Bobby Kennedy's case, that would have gotten out of the Vietnam War a lot sooner. Of Teddy Kennedy, the youngest brother, the youngest Kennedy brother, becomes a senator and lives in public life much longer than either of his brothers. He becomes one of the key voices for the issues that motivated his older brothers, but also his own commitment to poverty. If you put the three Kennedy brothers together, it's a legacy that's pretty rare in American politics. You generally don't have dynasty.
What do you think in politics specifically the Kennedy family is most remembered for?
I think that the Kennedy story is going to be very different depending on how old someone is and what happened when they were looking at politics. But the story itself is one of a commitment to public service at great sacrifice. It is astonishing when you look at it in retrospect that after having two brothers assassinated, a third brother is willing to be prominent in politics. it must it was a horrible experience for the family to go through, and yet they continued to return to public service, and the next generation as well. There was a lieutenant governor of Maryland who was a Kennedy. There were congressmen in the Kennedy family, and so there is to this day, a Kennedy legacy that really is committed to this issue of economic opportunity and educational opportunity, especially.